This is Phantom Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air with Inga Aksamit for the first time. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Glad to be here.
So we love to talk to people from around the world. We've been podcasting since 2016, and we're about 1,200 episodes in. It's fun to talk to people from all walks of life. And before we get into the heart of your story, we always ask every guest a couple questions. What motivates you, and why do you do what you do?
I have an internal drive to share what I learn. And when I write about either my travels or my thoughts or feelings or my story, and I get feedback from people, that helps me form a connection that makes me feel connected to my wider community and the rest of the world. So it creates this feedback loop that keeps me going to want to share more. And writing is my creative outlet. I'm not much of a painter or a potter or other kinds of artistic pursuits, but I do enjoy writing. I like telling stories and I like shaping words.
Well, we love to talk to creative people. That's been like the whole focus of the podcast, and how people create is kind of a focus with how we know everybody comes to the work they do in
Mhm.
different approaches. And you're an award-winning author, you're a travel writer, you're a globe-trotting adventurer, and your
Mhm.
book Between Worlds is like it's an expat's quest for belonging. That's the name of the book.
Yes.
That's interesting. I just to know I was an expat. I lived in Tokyo, Japan with my family from 2004 to 2006. My daughter actually attended a Japanese preschool and kindergarten.
Oh, so you know a little bit about the
So,
lifestyle.
my first country I ever went to was Japan. So that was
Mhm.
very extreme. I had to jump right
Yes,
into the culture, and that wasn't like going to Canada or going to UK. It's like, oh, I have to actually learn how to talk to get around.
exactly. And my book opens with my first visit to Japan and how different it is. So I can definitely relate.
That's interesting. So I see your books all around you in the background.
Hmm. Yeah.
So one of the things that what we're going to talk about is the benefits and challenges of growing up as a third culture kid, right?
Hmm.
Now,
Yes.
what people might not understand what that third culture kid, what that means. Can you kind of tell people?
Yeah, it's kind of a cumbersome term, and it got started in the 50s and 60s when research started being done on kids who grew up living the kind of lifestyle I did, and we just kind of got stuck with it, and we used the acronym TCK that kind of flows a little bit better. But to briefly describe what a third culture kid is, the first culture refers to our passport culture. So for me, that's the United States. That's the the culture that I grew up in for my first few years. And the second culture refers to the host culture. So even though I had a bunch of different countries that I lived in 5 different countries. The second culture does refer to any of those host countries. So
Mhm.
Pakistan, Peru, East Pakistan, and Indonesia. The
Well, so
third
you're Eastern.
Yeah, yeah. So not much in Europe at all. Some people actually jump to the conclusion that I might have lived in Europe when I tell them I had an expat lifestyle. So the third culture refers to the most unusual part, which is the culture that is shared by all people who grew up like I did in other countries. And so we have a certain set of characteristics that we share that set us apart a little bit, although we go through a lot of the same things everybody else does. So with your daughter, when she was in Japan, she went through some of the same things that I went through, but also everybody. So one thing about us is we tend to be very comfortable traveling. I love being in airports. I love going to airports and being around all the hubbub and seeing all the signs of all the places I could be going that day. And we also tend to be pretty adaptable
Hmm.
and flexible as we move between cultures.
Yeah, because I think a lot of times people have like a cultural kind of dominance, in terms like when we were in Japan, we would see, the gaijin coming in. I don't know if you the gaijin is like how Japanese refer to foreigners.
Yeah.
And we felt like it's like, oh, we're kind of getting the point of view from the Japanese perspective of what because the gaijin was like not paying attention to little subtle things like people all walking the same way down the sidewalk
Correct.
or being
Yeah.
really loud when most people are not
Mhm.
being loud. People like
Mhm.
throwing trash on the ground when you don't do that. Certain
Mhm.
things that, like was culture they just didn't know. They
They're not attuned to
tuned
paying
to it.
attention to some
They
of
don't pick
those small, some of those nuances. And then for me, looking like I do, I'm a white woman. I definitely had the perspective of being the different one, the one who looked very different from the places that I lived. I often was much taller. I was
Mhm.
kind of a tall kid. I was 5'6" by the time I was in sixth grade, so I tended to tower over some of the people who lived in some of the countries I was in. So I often just wanted to blend in and not look so different.
Did you ever have what my daughter refers to as like a reverse culture shock? Like when we came
Yes.
back from Japan, because her only schooling was with a sensei at Nishimachi, and that was like what she was used to. That the Japanese school system is very different than
Yeah, I had
Americans.
exactly the same thing as your daughter because when we moved to Pakistan, I was only 4 years old. So my first, kindergarten, first, second, third grade, um, was all in an American school in Pakistan. I went to school with Pakistani kids whose parents were, on the wealthy side that could afford to pay the tuition, but also I went to school with people from all different countries, from Europe and Australia and other Asian countries. So for me, we form our earliest memories around 4 years old, 3.5 or 4 years old, and around that time, the memories that are very vivid to us are things that are dramatic or traumatic. And so for me, going to Japan, some of those scenes are indelibly imprinted. But then all the rest of my early schooling, my first friends that I remember, all of that was in Pakistan. So when my parents ultimately said we were going home, that was very confusing to me because
Where's
for them, we were going home to their home, the United States. But for me, that was home.
Yeah,
And so I think what your daughter experienced and what I experienced the multiple times that I lived in the States in between our overseas assignments, a lot of us relate that our most difficult adjustment periods were not in the other countries, they were in the United States. So
yes.
that was the most traumatic for me, each of the times that we had to do that. And I think for my parents too, they really identified with the expat lifestyle, and that was who we were as a family. We were an expat family, and so for all of us, we would kind of limp through those first months, being back in the States.
Yeah, because I mean, being in Tokyo, one of the greatest cities in the world, and I was living in downtown Tokyo, like near Roppongi. That
Yeah, yeah,
and that kinda it's like expat land. There was this area, Moto Azabu, which is near like Roppongi, but there's this area where all these expats lived, and
yeah,
they were from all over the world. Very diverse group of expats. We were kind of all in that zone. But like when I had to come back to Connecticut, I came back to Connecticut in a small town called Canton. It's like super. It's not Hartford. It's not
yeah.
like Springfield. It's
Right,
not like
right.
Boston or New York. It's this little small town, hill town. There's like hardly anybody there. Like I'm used to being able to go in Tokyo at any time of night, go to any restaurant I want, any kind of anything, go to Akibar and pick up electronics. And then when suddenly like I don't have all this access.
Yeah,
Like,
actually, we almost
but
always live in capital cities. One time in Peru, we lived in an extremely remote area about 600 or 800 miles north of Lima. But most of the other times we were in big cities, so we had access to a lot of things that aren't available in smaller towns. But also the people that you were with in the expat community were familiar with. A lot of other places in the world. And so
Mhm.
when I would go back to my school, not so much in San Francisco, which is, of course, also culturally very diverse,
Yeah, it is.
I was more comfortable in the schools there than I was when we moved to a wealthy, predominantly white suburb. And there I was extremely different. I looked the same as everybody else, but nobody knew any of the countries that I came from. They didn't really want to know where they were or what it was all about.
Yeah, that's kind
And
of
their world was very different. Most of the kids were just concerned with what sports teams they were going to be on, and
very
um,
narrow, not very
very,
expansive. Do you
yeah,
find being an expat because like I was exposed to people from like everywhere.
yeah,
So there was people from London, Australia, Taiwan,
exactly.
Hong Kong, Germany, and they really I met these expats that could speak multiple languages.
Yes,
When they
yes.
come back to America and people can barely speak Spanish, right?
Right, right.
Or have full command of English.
Exactly,
So then I was like, I'm
exactly.
used to these people having and when you speak multiple languages, I think it gives you a cultural perspective where it seems you're more expansive, you're
Mhm,
more willing to listen, you're more listening to open to ideas that maybe aren't so narrow. But if you come to a perspective where you just say, "Well, we're number 1," right?
mhm.
And you just focus on the sports and the small talk, they're not gonna go into conversations about global issues.
Exactly, and because I was in 2 different wars and we had, military evacuations, and I felt a certain affinity for the places that I lived, uh, I I am often really torn when I have to decide who's right or wrong in a certain
Mhm.
side, because rarely is it such a clean
Black
picture.
and white, yeah,
We
it's
get a
not
lot of
black and
pro
white.
Yeah, you get a lot of propaganda on both sides. A lot of countries engage in propaganda. We have our own propaganda, and so for me, it just is becomes very confusing, and what I end up feeling is just a lot of pain
Mhm.
for things like war and where people are dying, and I
But
don't really know where to place my loyalty, because I'm a loyal American. I've always been um, very proud of my country, and so that's hard sometimes when you see that maybe decisions were made that were difficult and had an impact on the people that I cared about in other countries.
well, yeah, because it's like a balance of power game. Yeah, I'm a political science
Mhm.
major out of Bowdoin,
Mhm.
but, the idea there's, like, these I think sometimes people don't fully understand, like, the chess game that is, like, international politics and
Yes,
gamesmanship. You got the, NATO countries, you got Eastern countries, you got all these different countries in different zones, and they got their own interests.
absolutely. And
Yeah,
as
the interests converge, and some don't.
I had the experience of living in these countries when I was a child. So when I asked my dad why was India and Pakistan fighting, um, I'm 8 years old. I don't really have an understanding. So when he said they were fighting over Kashmir, well, we had visited Kashmir, which is a
You didn't know
beautiful
what that
place.
was.
So for me, I thought, well, why wouldn't India want it back? It's such a nice place, without considering any of the
History.
political implications. So when I was when I was writing my book, I had to go back and research what was going on in the world, because it's not just 2 countries or 3 countries even. It's what's going on all around the world, and where do people's loyalties lie, and what are the angles
Yeah,
the politicians are trying to achieve. So it was really helpful to look at some of the books that have been written on some of these situations, and especially because a lot of materials are now declassified, so I could get even closer to the real picture, of which we knew very little when we were in the middle of it.
yeah, because a lot of times I think if you're an expat, you have a more global point of view that is like
Mhm.
it's like you're able to see both sides or see multi sides, because a lot of things
Right.
are kind of nationalism versus like globalism. Like, so are you a citizen of if you're an expat, you're like a citizen of the world because you
Correct.
can have an affinity to all the countries you've been in, and you can
And
have
plus,
respect for the
you
culture in
you've
those.
probably made friends. You were talking about your expat community in Japan, so you had friends who were in Germany. You had friends from other countries, maybe in the Middle East, maybe in other parts of Asia. And then when you see what's happening, that all the citizens are not, they don't have a desire to harm us, for
No,
example.
no. Yeah, the
And
general
so,
populations of any country don't wanna
yeah,
harm usually anybody else. It's usually like, it's the leadership, it's the
right.
politicians
And it's
that make
important for
big
us to
decisions.
remember that we don't, we don't need to hate everybody in a certain country or in a certain religion, because not all of what we hear is coming from regular people who often, I mean, everybody's just trying to live their life, right? They're just
Yeah,
trying to
on
make
the
sure
farm,
they
in
have
the game.
shelter for their families and keep their families safe, and treat their friends with loyalty and respect. And we're not involved in these geopolitical strategies.
Yeah, because the geopolitical nature of things, it's a resource game, it's a balance of power game. It's,
Hmm.
in terms of, in today's world is very complicated because we've got all these critical resources. They're all over the globe. And a lot of what's going on is in terms of people, and it's always kind of been the reason, whether it was oil in the past, now it's like
Hmm.
rare earth minerals,
Hmm.
water, other things, political, like, positioning to like key
Right.
waterways,
Right. And
key
that's only gotten more
more
complicated
complicated
with
with the tech.
with technology. And so, yeah, you think I've always been fascinated with global migration and what drives people to move from place to place. And so, in the old days, maybe it was primarily food that drove people to try to find additional resources. And now it's, maybe it's nickel, or maybe it's some,
Well,
an
yeah, even climate change
individual.
or reduce, you're getting like shorelines being reduced.
Hmm.
So like
Hmm.
most humanity tries to live near the water. If
Right.
you get extreme climate change reducing the usable land that people used to be on, and constant flooding or issues that suddenly cause migrations, because like if
Right.
areas are being damaged or like too hot,
Mhm.
like you get areas that get too hot, not enough water, too much water, and so you get these migrations that which are kind of natural human behavior is to migrate,
Mhm.
but
Right.
nationalism is a construct. Right, so you have
Correct.
this construct of a nationalism, but human beings, like animals, move
Mhm.
based on, like, the situation. So, like, they
Right.
do it for their own biological survival.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
then
So
and then suddenly it's like people are illegal or they're not illegal, and then we get into that. But it's like human beings, we're on the planet Earth, right? So I
mhm.
believe kinda at a high level, every human being on the planet Earth has a right to be on the planet Earth.
Right, and it's easy for me to see that if things aren't comfortable or they're not safe in a certain place, in the Americas, either because of politics or food availability or um, a livable temperature, then yes, they're going to want to move. Parents always want to make things safe for their children and provide them with a better life. So they'll go to extreme lengths to make that happen.
Yeah.
And it just
It's natural migration to me. I
yeah,
mean, if you look
it
at it
is.
like any animal, right, and we're the animals, but we always put ourselves at the
Mhm.
top of the pyramid. But like every animal moves based on, situation. The polar bears are moving,
Mhm.
and some
Mhm.
of them are probably going to adapt to be more like brown bears.
Mhm.
Just over time, that's probably what's going to happen. So then
Yeah,
they're
I
going to
was
move into grizzly brown bear territory. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. So that's what happens.
right. I was just looking at some things affecting the islands in the South Pacific, the Solomon Islands and the outer islands of Indonesia, and the tuna is migrating because of the temperature in the ocean, and so that's causing issues because they're moving in and out of international waters versus waters that are protected by individual countries, and so that brings
That's
up all
changing
kinds of
like fishing
conflict.
patterns. Yeah, because
Hmm.
like,
Hmm.
fishing fleets that had a known area now
Right.
we're in conflict with another area. So
Exactly.
then that's how it's like these boundaries are kinda like artificially created by man to say, like, well, what
Mhm.
happens when they move?
Mhm.
What happens when we have a climate situation, just like the, AI revolution, like, there's a lot of things changing in the planet in our real time that are changing how we have to react.
Yeah, and
And
it starts looking silly, that we have a boundary in Antarctica,
yeah,
across
it's
the
odd,
the
these
snowy
arbitrary
tundra,
lines. Yeah, you got these
or in the
lines.
water.
Yeah, you got these lines where you can't go here. It's like, well, that's not there anymore. So
Right,
now you gotta
right.
negotiate. It's okay, well, that's how we are. We gotta negotiate. But I think
Exactly.
it's just interesting, like, when you get a more holistic or like
Mhm.
a expansive point of view, then things become okay. You just don't have a dogma from like nationalism. Like, you go back to the like
Mhm.
Cold War. In
Mhm.
the Cold War is like, yeah, you're red, scare, this, that, it's like very clear. Like this is very clear cut. But now things are kind of muddy. We're not in an active like Cold War. It's become kind of like, well, what is that relationship? Well, I don't know.
And the more you even visit a place, without even living there, every time I go visit a country, my eye catches news reports about that country later on, and then I have just more of an affinity when I can picture the people and their setting, and have an appreciation for what they're going through. So that's one of the things that I hope for a lot of people that travel will accomplish, to open up their worlds and expand their worldview and their humanity.
Yeah, I think like learning that everybody's got common, like a common human attributes that we have like a tendency to kind of otherize people. So it's like, well,
Right.
this other, they're the problem, right? So it's instead of looking in the looking glass and kind of owning up to maybe our own failings,
Mm-hmm.
it's easier to say, and it's always happened with immigrants come in, every phase of immigrants coming through Ellis Island, they come into New York, and then people would blame that group for this and this group for that. Every group would get blamed. The newest group comes in, they get all the blame. As they get more
Exactly.
established, they get more connections, they
It's
get less blame. And then if
who's it at the time?
who's it? It's like so you can otherize them and say,
Mm-hmm.
"Hey, they're a problem. They're the
Mm-hmm.
reason why I can't do it." It's like, instead of looking at it in a real holistic saying, "What is this person actually keeping me from going where I need to go?
Mm-hmm.
Is it my own glass ceiling that's keeping me from going where I gotta go?" And they're an easy target for my own failings.
And even on a personal level, so we're talking in very global terms here, really interesting conversation. But on a personal level, I started discovering as I wrote my book that friends of mine that I had known for many years had lived the same lifestyle I did, but we never knew it. And so I thought, how did that happen? That I knew a person for 5 years or something, maybe I
Never
worked
talked
alongside
about
of
it.
them. We never talked about it, and I realized it's because I knew that I was being otherized, in the past, say in high school or, a little bit, when I got a little bit older, that when people would say, "Where are you from?" They're thinking I'm gonna say, I don't know, Wisconsin or another part of California or whatever. They're not expecting me to list this,
All the
litany
countries, all the
of
countries, yeah.
countries that they've never, heard of or paid attention to. And so after a while, I had some various different answers, which is another common attribute, which is when somebody asks where you're from, is do you give them the 30-second, the the 10-minute or the 30-minute version.
Oh, yeah.
And so sometimes it was just easier for me to say San Francisco because that's where my father's company was based and that's where we would return to. So that was the closest thing I had to a home base. And so I would give these, short answers like, oh, we moved around a lot.
Oh,
And some people would never ask where, they just maybe
mhm.
assumed it was the US. And that's fine because that means that they didn't really want to know that much. And therefore, I don't really want to give that much of my time or that much of myself or open myself up to that vulnerability of being of being
Yeah,
different.
yeah. Did you
So,
find sorry, but did you find when you were abroad that that answer changed? Like, if you
yes.
like, would you tell them you actually had been in these other countries when you were in another country?
Yes. And because I think, I don't know, maybe it's just the people you meet when you're traveling yourself, so we meet our guides and we meet people in hotels and we meet other travelers. And so we meet people who are already predisposed to maybe having that wider worldview that we were talking about. And so it's much more natural. They're much more interested, and they're open to it. And so there's other places like Hawaii, for example, where I feel very comfortable because I meet a lot of people who live in Hawaii who travel a lot or have lived the expat lifestyle as well. There's a lot of cultural
Yeah.
diversity in Oahu, for especially. And so I'm much more open. And now, after writing the book, I'm actually much more open about telling people
Even in the
more,
States.
yeah, even in the states, and just sharing more of myself, because the more I share, the more maybe we will make a connection, or even if we don't, they know a little bit more about me, and I would rather be open than be closed. So I
Yeah.
have adjusted, once I recognized that, I kind of adjusted my approach.
Well, I think it's kind of like the behavior that, when you're in the US, it does seem sometimes like that you have, I don't want to say it's shallow, but people don't want to go that in depth, right? When I
Right.
found I was in the expat world, we were able to
Hmm.
talk to people,
Hmm.
and it was like we were going on, and we would, I get invited to go out and hang it just from an initial meeting.
Right.
Right, that it
Right.
would go a lot deeper and further than in the US. I'd have to realize, like, in Connecticut, I have to back off that when
Right.
I was in Canton, in Simsbury, I could not do that. If I
One
did,
of the
people acted like I was weird.
one of the characteristics of third culture kids is sometimes going too fast and too deep in relationships, because we've all only had the experience of not having much time. So we don't have 5 years to, slowly get to know one another. Because when I was growing up, when I was overseas, most of us were on 2-year contracts, and those might be extended to 4 years. But we would share a lot, and sometimes that would blow up. That doesn't always work. But
Mhm,
yeah, we would want to move really, really fast. So I find when I meet other TCKs, even now, as adult TCKs, we talk really fast. It's like, where did you live? Oh my gosh, I live there. And oh my gosh, I want to go there. And so we're just like talking as fast as we can to
and we're
cram it
kinda
all
time
in.
boxed, and you're
Yeah. And
time
so
boxed
maybe,
into your experience,
yeah,
so you feel like you gotta live your life in a faster frame,
on fast forward. Yeah, I met somebody, and their wife was tugging on him. We got to go. We got to go. We got to make the bus. And we were in Oregon, of all places, a really rural area. And we were just like, wait, let me give you my email, because we want to make that connection. So, like you say, you might be invited into somebody's home for dinner, and you just met them on a train or something,
yeah.
because you make that connection. So that's one of the things I love is just that human sharing.
But the being so adventurous, one thing I probably get into, like maybe hidden scars from the experience.
Hmm.
Do you kind of feel like
Yeah.
that comes out?
Yes. So there's all kinds of positive things I can say about the third culture kid lifestyle, or the expat lifestyle for adults, and all of those are very true. And if people ask me, would I change anything if I had to do it over again, and I would not. I loved the lifestyle that we lived, but I did have to face the fact that there were actually some some traumas that happened along the way. And so for me, that happened around my early 30s, when I realized that I had a series of short-term relationships, romantic relationships. And so I started thinking, I've got everything else, my education's complete, I've got a good job, I've got friends, why am I not able to sustain a long-term relationship? So I went to therapy for a little bit, and the therapist really helped me understand that I had endured some childhood trauma, and that it deserved to be looked at and processed. And so, being in the wars, one of the consequences of the wars was that we had these evacuations. We had to leave everything behind. We had to leave my father behind, because it was only for women and children.
Mm,
And so that was a family separation. So we were away from my father. We had to leave him in a war zone, and only the women and children got evacuated. I left my classmates. I was on the same plane with a lot of them, getting evacuated to Tehran. Tehran, Iran was our safe haven.
Wow.
And so we were evacuated to Tehran, and I just waved at the airport and said, see you when we get back. We all assumed that this would blow over and that we would be back. And then when my father finally did get out, he said, no, we're close enough to the end of my contract that we'll just stay in the States for a while, and I'll get another job, and then we'll go overseas again. I never saw my friends again. This was pre-internet. There was no email.
Yeah,
We didn't have addresses because our addresses no longer existed, and we would have had to use my grandparents' address. And I was 8 years old. I didn't know anybody's last name necessarily, so I never saw those classmates again, and that happened over and over to me. And so those separations, my favorite teachers, my house, my school, I just kept having to start over and start over. I went to 13 different schools before university and a few more after that for a total of 20. So I had a lot of, first days of school. And what the war in East Pakistan, when it ultimately led to the birth of Bangladesh, was a very violent and bloody war. And I was 13 by then, but I saw and heard things that were, not normal for a young teen. And back then, nobody was particularly worried about how children were doing, how they were coping. And so I had loving parents, and they endured some of their own pain. And when we got away from those situations, we really never talked about it much.
No crisis counseling, no kind of counseling, and no acknowledgement of PTSD.
No. And so I think even for my parents, they could have used that. My mom, again, had to leave her husband in a very terrible war zone when we got evacuated from Dhaka, East Pakistan. And so I think we all could have used some debriefing on that one. And so I went back to this, wealthy suburb with the white kids who hadn't been out of.
Never been in a war people hadn't been in wars like that since World War II.
Right. And this was like a hidden war because everybody was consumed with what was going on in Vietnam. And so it didn't get much press. So nobody had any concept of what I had been through. So I just shoved it away and, went to high school and, tried out for the basketball team and, did all the things I was supposed to do to kind of fake it as an American teenager. So, you can put all that stuff away and you don't have to deal with it right then, but it's going to come back and bite you.
Yeah, because that's the whole thing. Is you build up this whole
Yes.
to a point where you're it's like an overload.
Yes, in fact, this TCK training group has a term for it. They call it the grief tower. It kind of evokes an image of little pebbles piling up on top of each other, and you're like balancing the rock sculpture, and then one little pebble goes on there, and then the whole thing falls down. And it just crashes, and then you have to deal with it. So this therapist helped me understand that I had never developed any skills in learning how to manage long-term relationships and conflicts and all the things that come up. And I had all this trauma that was just sitting there waiting to be unpackaged. So she helped me a lot. And then so I kind of regard that as phase one of my, recovery. Mm-hmm. I happened to meet the man who became my husband, and we've been married for 33 years. So we did something right.
This stability there.
This therapist and I, I consider her kind of life changing. And then I regard the second phase as when I was writing the book, because I dove back into the modern literature on childhood trauma, but also loneliness, belonging, the happiness study that was done by Harvard. And it's amazing how all of those studies studying different aspects of psychology came to the same conclusion, which is that human relationships, those social relationships, are the most important thing that we have. So that has helped me understand the value of community as a thing. And I never had much of a long-term community when I was growing up. And so now that I've been in a place for more than 10 years, which is the longest I've ever lived in a place by far, I'm learning to value more and more what that community does in terms of a safety net, in addition to the close friends and family that I have.
But it seems like if you're somebody that's been an expat and you're moving every 2 years, kind of a contract, then that kind of stability or safety that you get from from being in your hometown for 10 years or
Hmm.
15 years that like a lot of Americans probably know that kind of situation where they have that hometown, they got their
Hmm.
little small town, that's what they know. But there's an advantage in terms of like being able to understand the world. The disadvantage is
Hmm.
maybe your development gets kind of like maybe you feel that okay, I'll just go to the next place. But the problem is like if that's something inside you is gonna keep on going with you to the next place, to the
Right.
next. It
You
doesn't
just carry
that
it with you.
that doesn't change. Like you are the same person in the looking glass that you were in Tokyo,
Hmm.
that you are in London, that you're in Germany. They're like it's the same person.
Right, right. So there's definitely pros and cons, for every pro for being adaptable, for being flexible. Um, the downside of that is that a person who moves around all the time and is always adopting and adapting can lose sight of who they actually are inside, what their values are. If you move from one friend group to another friend group, I always think of this example like, what if the community that you develop happens to be a community of criminals, where like when do you all of a sudden go, wait a minute, that's not me. If I have certain values and this is violating my value system, because maybe you've never had to actually identify what your own values are. So there's some things that are very protective and help us get through all those changes. And then there's things that have to be addressed in young adulthood to smooth out the development. So in some ways, TCKs are advanced, and some ways that they lag behind in human development.
What was the most surprising thing you found when you were doing your research for Between Worlds?
Um, there were certain things that I learned about the politics that surprised me. And so I became really fascinated with learning about the history. And also, I didn't have a lot of curiosity about what my father was actually doing in some of these countries. And he was an irrigation engineer, which isn't a fascinating topic in and of itself necessarily. But I got really curious about why the heck we were in all these places. And I was amazed to find that the World Bank has digitized all their records of the projects that they funded through USAID. And a lot of my father's projects were in there. So I could
Oh,
actually
wow.
pull up like a 20-year report. We weren't there 20 years, but I could see the seeds of what he had worked on that were successful in some of the cases, even though we might have been pulled away because of war. So that really surprised me, because I think I had this impression, and maybe it was even supported by my parents, that the projects he worked on often ended for naught, that they worked for 2 years out of a 4-year project, maybe. Uh, uh, and then the war happened and it all would have, gone up in smoke.
Hmm.
And then to find that those studies still formed the foundation that changed the agricultural methods that allowed countries to either import less to feed their people or to develop enough to export was incredible. So in Peru, for example, I thought that because of a coup, we left and probably the desert had just taken over whatever was going on in the project site. But when I went back a few years ago, I talked to a guide a little bit further south, and she was telling me how proud she was of her city, which now had over 1 million people, and they were exporting lots and lots of. She rattled off this whole list of fruits and vegetables and nuts, um, and I happened to mention what my father did, and she said, "Oh, that was exactly the time when the government was doing the feasibility studies to see what would grow in the desert if nourished by some of the rivers that came down from the Andes." And so, I mean, I was so proud of my father. He had passed away by then, but I was like, "Dad, do you hear that? Your work was not in vain." So that was a big
That's
surprise.
really, I think that's really good to hear because when you brought up USAID, I mean, that's a big topic going on now in the US. But like
It is.
it's like I remember like when Kennedy said, "What can you do for your country?" There was a whole generation of people that went out into
Hmm.
and did a lot of work because of what Kennedy kind of put out there.
Right.
And now we've kind of got this mindset where like, oh, it doesn't matter. Like, oh,
Right.
we want to just be America first. And it's like there was a whole generation of people that felt it was important to go outside the country and kind of give us soft power.
Right. It was soft diplomacy that
And that
built
has a value.
goodwill. Hmm.
That's like the
Yeah.
value. It's like maybe it doesn't on the sometimes you look at a spreadsheet and you look at the value, you see a bunch of numbers, but you can't really tell what the value is.
Right. Right.
And so some people were kind of like accountants and say, "Well, I want to be efficient," but like fire department doesn't make a profit.
Right.
Yeah.
And they want to know
And
what the value is, what the return is,
what the
in
return
a
sometimes,
year or what 2
yeah, it
years.
might be a
And
10-year return. It might be a
exactly.
decade-long return. It might be a soft power return, but it doesn't give
Right.
you direct money. It has to be something that maybe if you have a more holistic point of view,
Hmm.
that that the short-term first quarter return
Hmm.
would make you not want to do it. But you look
Correct.
at the
Hmm.
5-year, 10-year, it does have a return. And people don't want to think in those, in a more long frame. You know,
Exactly.
I think it's
Exactly.
good to kind of slow down a little bit and like, do you really think out like what your actions and what your things are doing, and connections to people, what
Right.
your whole life experience has been connecting with people.
Not to mention all those people that went out were sharing their expertise and helping the local people. So the people in Peru or in Indonesia, the engineers there had the benefit of working with engineers from the United States, like my father, as well as a Taiwanese firm that they were working with. So, 3 different countries came together to share their expertise and help with the development. And now, those countries are functioning pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, 'cause if you think about it, like, it's like if you teach somebody how to fish, you don't have to
Mhm.
give them a fish. You teach them how to plant, you have the this whole idea like micro grants and people being
Right.
micro level entrepreneurs comes from people providing expertise, coming and doing like little startup, enterprises to show somebody like, well, I can show you how to work the land more efficiently. I can show you how to build a little factory for your Etsy like product. I could show you how to actually be able to not just take a grant, but take that grant and become your own little micro entrepreneur, or be able to be self sufficient. That's going to gain, in terms of like the next generation. Maybe they didn't get to go to high school, they didn't get to
Mhm.
go to trade school, but their kids can go to a trade school, high
Right.
school, college, get somewhere. I mean, that's always the thing is the upward mobility of just giving people chances.
I agree.
I think so. But if you go in the world and it's not just like a tourist visa. Like
Hmm.
you were actually an expat, you get to actually learn the culture. If you just go
Right.
somewhere for a week or two, you don't really absorb what you get if you're somewhere for 2 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, right?
Right. Right.
So what do you tell people who maybe want to go on this expat journey? What the cost or benefits are?
The one thing that I think might already be different, or just that I would caution parents about in particular if they're bringing their kids over, there are all the wonderful things that people think are going to happen are true. That exposure to other languages and other cultures. And the one thing I would say is keep the communication open. And I think this happens a lot anyway, but there are so many more resources now. There's whole organizations that exist to provide data and studies and recommendations on how to manage the process. And I think things like honoring the losses, and so if you have to leave either suddenly or if it's planned, creating more rituals around how those endings
Yeah.
and beginnings happen, I think would go a long way. That I didn't necessarily have because it was just kids are resilient. They'll bounce back, and I think with that mindset, that openness, that would make a big difference for a lot of kids.
And also, like, maybe because we're in the internet age, that if you
Hmm.
left, you would have the email and the cell phone
Absolutely.
numbers, and it would be important for your kids, even if they're kindergartners, to know
Hmm.
have a contact list of all the people they knew, like, they know their teachers, know their friends, know their classmates, at least have a way to get back to them if they
Mhm.
wanted to.
One of the things I hear from the TCKs in the current era is that the sheer ease and number of people they could keep in contact with can become overwhelming. And
Mm.
so that presents its own challenge. You know, if
Oh,
you've moved to 6 different places and you have hundreds of classmates, you can't
it's too many.
possibly attend to all of those. So there's got to be some way of balancing, like, you know, focus on the one or two friends that meant the most and understand that things do change. So I think that that is really helpful. Being able to stay in touch is incredibly helpful. And also the number of TCK groups that are out there now. There's TCK podcasts, there's Facebook groups. I'm a moderator of one of them. And there's books and all kinds of resources. So I didn't even know the term TCK until after I had written the book, before it was published, but after I had written it. And so I thought, how did I get to my age without
No
knowing that?
acronym.
Once you have the term, you can search the world.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that has helped me so much now that both of my parents have passed away and I'm an only child. So there's nobody I have that can remember my own childhood. But I found classmates from Bangladesh that lived through the war that I did.
So you found them.
And so to be able to connect with them, even though I didn't know them at the time, we went through the same experience. When I hear them describe the scenes when the war started, the same scenes that I saw and heard, I don't feel so alone because I know there's other people out there that felt what I felt. And so that just helps me incredibly. And I know it helps anybody who's out there who thinks that, they're alone, because they're not. They estimate that there's 200 million TCKs floating around the universe here. So there's a lot easier ways to find them now.
Well, that's really important. I want to thank you for being on the show today. It's always amazing to hear these kind of stories, and
Thank
I have
you.
so connection to being an expat myself. So maybe I think I understood your
Mhm.
adventures. But we have ingasadventures.com, that
Mhm.
URL. So people click on that, what will they find there?
They'll find I've had that URL for a long time. So there's a lot of my travel stories on there. I like to write stories that will help people figure out how to navigate places on their own that are not necessarily, on the top 10 list. And I have a page dedicated to the book where you can find photos of me and my parents in some of these other countries. And I also have some tips, like packing tips. I'm a pretty good packer. I've been packing since I was 4. and there's I also have some reading lists if people are interested in some of the places that I lived, or I have a list of 10 of my favorite TCK memoirs. And so there's a lot of things on there on different pages that can help people.
And people can click on that in the podcast description. We were just live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We'll be on major platforms by the end of the day tomorrow, like Spotify and Apple and iHeartRadio. I want to thank you for being a guest on the Family Electric Ghost podcast. And we encourage people to click the URL, ingasadventures.com, to get the further details about your book and the other books you've written. And I want to thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been very enjoyable.